Hello again, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Jesse Richard, and on behalf of Everbridge, I'm excited to present this webinar with Pink Elephant, ITSM Deep Dive, Prioritization, Escalation, and Alerting. In this webinar, our presenters will explore how to establish a business-driven multi-factor priority model shared by multiple ITSM processes, and how this model drives automation related to escalation and alerting practices. After our speakers, we'll have a 10-minute Q&A session with both the speakers. As a reminder, you can submit your questions at any time during the webinar. You may send your questions by typing in the open text field in the questions panel and sending your questions to all panelists. If time runs out before your question is asked, we will try to follow up with you after the webinar. Links to the recording of the webinar and slides from today's presentation will be available later this week, and you can also look for a link to the recording of all our webinars on itllearning.com under the resources section. And now, I'd like to introduce you to our speakers. Troy Dumoulin is the VP of Research and Development at Pink Elephant. Troy is leading ITIL IT governance and lean IT authority with a solid and rich background in executive IT management consulting. Troy holds the ITIL expert certifications and has extensive experience in leading IT service management programs with a regional and global scope. He is a frequent speaker at IT management events and is contributing author to multiple ITSM and lean IT books, papers, and official ITIL publications, including ITIL's planning to implement IT service management and continual service improvement. After Troy, we'll hear from Vincent Jeffrey, Senior Director of Product Marketing here at Everbridge. Vincent has more than 14 years of experience in the information technology business, designing, promoting, and selling enterprise IT operations management solutions, including critical communications, application performance management, IT process, and workload automation. We're excited to have all of our experts here with us today. And now I'd like to turn it over to our first presenter, Troy. Off to you.
Thank you very much, Jesse. All right, so we are indeed doing a deep dive into the mysterious world of IT prioritization and classification. There's this dream out there that we can automate things, and there's a lot of great tools like the Everbridge product out there, service management suites, that do just that. They take this promise of escalation, notification, automation, and they make it real. But, there's the but, before we can automate something, it has to be defined and actually efficient and effective. So, reality is we have to know what we're automating and ensure what we build is something worth automating. And so that's the context of what I'll be sharing with you today. So context is a good word to start this off because, in the world of big data, we have lots of data out there produced by all of these different products around monitoring and escalation and notification, ticketing tools, workflow tools, etc. But how do I find a way to take all this now disparate data and to give it context? You might have heard in the past of the DIKW kind of data continuum. Data first, has to be introduced as information. That information has the beginning of context. So what does it mean? That information allows me to take that and apply some knowledge. What does it mean for me in the future? And then wisdom in respect to how can I proactively use this in collective context. But that whole context is set by, as we're going to see, a series of classification structures which are critical when you're implementing an ITSM overall process. All right. So our agenda today, we're going to look at just why do we need to think about an integrated framework or integrated process priority model. That'll bring us into examples of classification structures, prioritization model, and then we'll end with escalation and alerting. But a key thing I want to bring up before we kind of dive into the details of these various agenda items is that a lean principle for a system of value comprised of various agents, and those agents can be people, groups, systems. That's a concept of system thinking, and complex adaptive systems operate in the principle of multiple domains and dimensions and participants all working collectively. Now, the word velocity I've chosen here on a very specific and purposeful reason versus agility. Velocity is defined by speed with direction. For that value system, complex and adaptive as it might be, to gain collective velocity, they need to all be constant in how they do things and how they prioritize, how they practice certain activities. If each of those dimensions / agents / groups / silos were all being, let's use the word agile, and again, not a negative word in its own right, but agile means to be responsive and quick and nimble. But if they're all being agile in different directions, using different classification structures, or even the same classification structure in different ways, then you could actually kill velocity. So a key principle being the thing we all believe is true, is that we share constancy of purpose. And it's only when that complex adaptive system shares constancy of purpose that I can gain collective velocity. So this is a key principle as we go into this, thinking about this system velocity premise. Okay, so everything in life begins with an event. In previous webinars we've talked about this a little bit already. But in essence, not all events are negative. Some are simply there for acknowledging the fact that something has occurred, right? I have a backup that's completed, a batch job has run, I've been able to restore a file. These are just notifications. But there are some events out there that, deal in the world of anxiety. Anxiety is something we want to avoid, but life is full of anxiety, so we try to minimize the impact of anxiety and to shorten the timeline in which we actually respond to it. So this is where we get into the reality of we're getting an unavailable status. The availability of the service is in question, or the service is degraded. The performance isn't actually up to par. And so, people's willingness to be patient, of course, being a key issue. But it all begins with an event. Now, what we do with these events is going to be critical, right? Event management isn't just let's throw up an on-monitoring tool and let's see, green and yellow and red lights. Event management would also say, when I do have a yellow and or red condition, and it's, a situation where I have stress and anxiety, then what am I going to do? Am I going to, flow this alert into an incident management process for correlation and prioritization and potential restoration? Am I going to be tracking the potential repeat patterns of these events to understand where I might have repeat issues, which might be corresponding to an overall systemic problem? Then I have problem management investigate. So there's actually flow, workflow, process flow that actually would be built behind these monitoring tools, which would allow me to shorten the time from the point of view of event discovered to the concept of now what do I do next. These workflows have to be enabled by classification structures. What am I dealing with? What service is it? What priority am I dealing with in respect to the urgency of reaction in this context? So event might be the beginning, but it's more than just a monitoring tool. So a little bit about why we even have to think about these classifications in respect to multiple processes. So ITIL has a great source of knowledge in respect to the life cycle of how things are delivered. In essence, we're in a large demand supply chain. You might not have thought of it that way, but that's how it works. We get demand in one end, be it strategic, tactical, or operational demand, that turns the crank of a factory, which creates or enhances value, and on the other end, we supply. Now, there's a lot of processes in that service strategy, design, transition, operation world, but the thing is, these processes are not individual processes or silos. They're a flow. You can call it a process architecture, if you'd like, where we take stuff coming in one end and it produces outcome out the other. That would indicate there's a great deal of dependence or integration within these processes, which there is. So, you have to think about the ITIL processes across that life cycle. I like to use the metaphor, think about this room full of chairs, right? And all these chairs are tied together by string. And, you knock a chair over in the middle, the three chairs beside it, they fall over, and in the back of the room, one moves 6 inches. Unfortunately, you often feel like a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs, but that's the reality of how it goes. So if I'm going to have such integrated framework, I'm going to have to consider what it means to keep these processes glued together. And the basis for that gluing together of these processes are going to be the classification, prioritization, escalation models we're about to talk about. So this is just a basic set of ITIL processes, not the whole life cycle, but starting from the bottom up, we might get, incoming, be it service restoration issues, complaints from service. You might have requests for fulfillment. These are all going to be, of course, linked to this configuration management database. You're going to have event correlation across all of those. Those would indicate potential need for change relative to service restoration and or enhancement. All those changes need to be bundled up into a larger context of a release. And we have this veritable complex system of processes which require classification structures shared among them to be able to work as a shared process model or architecture. So our challenge is that people don't normally think of it this way. They'll attack the ITIL processes one by one. In fact, what typically happens is, to divide and conquer. We'll say, hey, Mary, you take change, and Joe, you take problem, and Jeff, you got incident, and they all go and prosper in their own corners, come up with their own their own models of process and classification. They might even use different tools, SharePoint for change management, ticketing tool for incident, Excel for problem. And in the end, they've basically painted themselves into proverbial process corners because they haven't built and integrated anything. They've implemented these processes in silos. Now, I want you to think about this from a more integrated perspective. All right, so typically you might start your journey on incident management. Most companies do because you have to do decent break fix to be called a service organization. So you might start there and you might think about all of these models we're about to talk from an incident perspective only. And you might, in your classification structure, actually embed verbs and adjectives respective of just incident management. But that's a problem because that classification structure around priority and category type item or service classification would also be potentially the one you use for problem, which would also be the thing you use for change, release, service level, monitoring them all. So I think about it this way. Literally, if I have problem records, which I can attach to multiple incident records, right? So I've got this problem record and many incident children are hanging off of it. Then that problem record will produce a known error, and that known error record will basically attach to a change record. That change record then might be one of many in a release. I literally have this backbone or this vertebrae, this connecting tissue between all of these processes. And if I don't get this right, I literally can break the back of my ITIL process automation. So they share common classification. Again, I'm just showing you a sample set, all of which will, of course, be connected to the same database of people context, which also has a taxonomy of business unit, department, team, and individual. Configuration management, the same thing, because I'm going to be classifying the records at the CMDB level by the service the CI configuration item is connected to and or the technical domain it's connected to. So hopefully this kind of gives you a sense of the business reason why these classification structures are so critical to be shared. So here's some examples. This is just a couple of examples. Traditionally, we think about categorization in the context of technology and technology grouping. So on the left-hand side, you see top-level hardware, mid-level desktop. Under desktop, I've got a monitor, and under monitor, I could even have a specific model number. So I have this ability to click through and select drop-downs to classify that. But what if this monitor, so-called, was actually part of several critical services? How would I gain that understanding? Right, so, or if it was a switch, or if it was a server or an application, I'd want to be able to collectively understand how many incidents, problems, changes, requests I'm getting around a specific type of category of technology. But I also, if that's an incident coming in or a problem that I'm dealing with, want to understand if that is hitting a specific service. And now that's not the same classification structure. Typically, it's going to be a secondary classification on my record. So I might categorize it according to the technology that's failed or being requested for enhancement. But I also want to say, regardless of the purpose or the reason that I have an outage, we'll use email because we'll come back to that later in our webinar. Let's say I'm getting all these calls for email. I initially classify it in a technology context. which I'm guessing because I have no real idea about what technical component has failed. But the one thing I do know is that it's been an email service outage, right? So regardless if the technology classification changes multiple times, I still at the end of the day want to be able to report, show me all the incidents, problem changes, and releases are related to email as a service, and give me a secondary breakdown by technical domain or dimension. So this is a critical way to, if you're going to be looking at measuring and monitoring service consumption and reporting, you have to do this either in a classification structure like I'm demonstrating now, or through a configuration item association, which is also a potential way to do this, because if I have an incident problem change request type of record, I can potentially attach a service CI, a record from my CMDB, which represents email as a service. And now I can, extract that service correlation a little bit differently, but I still have to do both. So these classification structures, some rules of thumb, right? They describe generically an environment and or a specific service. They're not your configuration management database in their own right. I've literally seen more than once categorization structures where the last tier of the category was an actual instance of an asset. Now imagine what that looks like in an organization which has tens of thousands of these assets. It's a complete mess. It's not departmental or role-based. There's another classification around that, around people and or support groups. But I can't now get into this taxonomy, including some kind of organizational context, because that changes over time. I need it to support multiple processes, so I'm not going to put in my generic classification structure password reset, which is a verb or adjective reflective of either the service and or the hardware. That's going to have to be another action, another drop-down, which qualifies this classification. You shouldn't have it in the standard CTI, category type item. Right? It's going to be critical for me to get any kind of sense of repeat issues or trends. Right? Where are my top 10 incident categories, and which services are they impacting, and what's the frequency of their correlation within the organization? It's going to drive automation, especially around queue assignment. So when it's this technology and this service in this specific geographic location, who gets to do first, second, third support? If I'm going to automate that queue assignment, I have to have this clearly defined. It's going to drive, as we're going to see, SLAs around service restoration as well. So this is key. Now, the reality of this is that this organic structure is organic. It's always going to be changing because your environment changes. So I'm not one of these people who say you can't have an other category, because if you can't find what you're looking for, then obviously you've got to put it somewhere. But the last thing you want is another category that's not managed. In fact, what happens typically is, it just becomes a, garbage bin. Everybody can't figure out or take the time to figure out, and they put it into the other category. And now I'm not dealing with that as either an opportunity for education and or the need to modify. Now, because this classification structure becomes so critical as a vertebrae tying all these processes together, which they're all using the same one, you certainly don't want this to have, ungoverned control, where anyone can add any kind of leaf or, limb to this structure. So this structure becomes a critical shared classification policy, and it becomes something under a process for changing and change management, right? So, it's that critical, otherwise it begins to go south on you very quickly. So that's your generic classification structure based on technology and service, and that's not either or, that's and. Now let's think about priority considerations, because some work by nature simply takes precedent over other work. And so this is true of whether we're going to restore one incident before another incident, whether we're going to do root cause on a problem before another problem, whether we're going to do one change in advance of another change, or what, from a release perspective, takes precedent over other releases. So this priority model is not, again, only something we use for service restoration. The basis for how we determine how fast we move and what priority something comes in will be shared across all processes. The business rules, what we do with this now known priority, will be different per process. Because in an incident classification, it might be I need to restore service within X number of hours. Within a problem, I might need to think about it from the point of view, I need to get to root cause within X number of days. Within a change, it must, it probably will take a sequencing perspective in scheduling. So, how we deal with the business rules from the priority model will be different, but the basis of how we establish priority will be the same across multiple processes. And it will be multiple dimensions, as we can see here, right? So it's not just, how many people are impacted. There's a lot here with respect to the brand and financial and liability and legal requirements. So we're going to talk about how we can, look at building one of these models which take multiple dimensions in hand, because the last thing you want to do is be guessing at this at the service desk or ask a service desk professional to have all of this in their brains at that moment of stress and try to imagine and guess what the priority is, because I can guarantee you what you will get is a high variability, of course, in how it's done, but in the essence, it all defaults back to the squeaky wheel, which isn't any kind of way to establish priority. I think you could all agree. So how does that work? From theory perspective, we know there's a couple of factors here. So traditionally, before ITIL kind of became a popular model, it was all about severity, and some of you probably are still using the severity concept. Severity and the word impact are synonymous, and we'll see a number of different indicators in a moment about what that means. But in general, it's really reflective of how big is big and how bad is bad. It's how wide, how impactful, what's the scope of this thing? Is it one person? Is it five? Is it, organizational wide? Now, degree or, scope of failure is one context. The other is urgency, and urgency is separate than degree or failure, because I could have something that's organizational wide, but it's not as mission critical as something else that's potentially organizational wide. So I have to kind of get to the sense of speed, and I've already kind of given you an indication it's going to be based on the mission of the organization. So we're going to combine these two pieces, and then, of course, there's always the reality of the reality check. If something takes just a moment, and I have 100 things, like I have 5 minutes to do something, I can still use human logic to do something based on the ease of doing so, expected effort. So let's get a little bit deeper here in the context of impact analysis. So as I already mentioned, we can talk about this in the concept of how big is big, right? I've got my little pocket pooch versus the big dog. And the reality is here we're getting into scope, whether it's geographic or it's multiple business units, it's an internal only, or it's affecting external clients. It's looking at this from the point of view of this degree of failure. And yes, we have to look at it differently, that one person can never be the same as a complete organizational failure. Now, does that mean that one person has the same urgency across the board as another person? Not at all, because we'll talk about VIP type of personas as well, which is not always, by the way, about org chart and about political power. We'll come back to that. But for now, understand that we're talking about impact, we're talking about degree. What gets a little bit more complicated is this context of urgency. So urgency basically goes back to the mission of the organization. So many of you listening today are working for companies whose primary mission is profitability, revenue generating for your shareholders, whether that's a privately held company or you're publicly traded. In the end, you're in the business of generating a profitable return on investment for somebody, right? So in that context, mission is about profit. But not all of you are working for mission-based companies. You could be working for healthcare, and in this case, the most critical services you provide are about health and welfare. Hopefully that's true in a healthcare scenario. Or if you're in a military situation, you're going to be supporting frontline support. So frontline support will be, of course, higher in urgency than back office clerical type work. Or if you're in a government scenario, you're looking for the best interest of your constituency. So mission is always the beginning of the conversation. And so we think about that. Let's use profit as the basis for the general conversation here. We've got to figure this out ahead of time. First of all, there are certain individuals or roles or personas which have a direct correlation to revenue in the profit scenario. So if I'm doing online investment in banking, then an online investment type of role will be critical because they're going to either make or lose money by the millions in a matter of minutes versus an individual who's back office. So the role of that person has to be taken into consideration. I've already mentioned about, some services that I provide are direct to revenue. So again, using the online banking metaphor, if I've got an application or service which is about making trades, that's going to be a mission critical. Something that supports, but it's indirect to making trades, it's going to be support to mission. Something like your internal intranet, very indirect, distantly, we're going to have something further out. Brand reputation, legal compliance, security, data protection. In fact, some organizations, if you're in the government, you have classified and unclassified, right? So sensitivity comes into context here. Partners relative to what you've agreed in contracts, safety and health. All of these factors would be taken into consideration when thinking about how fast do I jump versus something else. And again, it's too complicated for you to kind of do this on the fly. So you have to have something that's going to be done ahead of time that allows you to, with some kind of multi-dimensional perspective, gain agreement around this. And that's critical because, again, if none of you have agreement around how big is big and small is small and how fast do I jump versus something else, we're going back to that whole question of constancy of purpose, right? You're all being agile based on your own subjective relativism. So if you can't agree on a shared priority model and what that looks like, then ask yourself, what hope do you have to stand up behind any SLA? You think it's a priority 1, I think it's a priority 2, John over there thinks it's a priority 3, and we just spend, minutes, hours, days arguing and debating, reality, which, by the way, is unfortunate because it's usually what I find. So here's an example, kind of, walking you through some of this. This is a customer example. It's actually something that was actual from one of my past engagements. And so what you're seeing here is the concept of keeping a simple 4-level model. And again, in my experience, you should never go beyond 4. Get beyond that, you're starting to get into challenges. So your urgency factor, right? Coming back to our revenue conversation. Critical, it's got to directly impact revenue. High, it's indirect. Medium, it's intercompany transfer, collaboration, operational efficiencies. Low, it's a productivity tool for one person. Now, I want you to begin to think about your services or your applications even, you begin to pre-classify those relative to this urgency factor, because that can be done and should be done ahead of time. And when I classify it as this has failed in respect to technology and or service, the urgency should be auto-populated based on a predefined model. What then takes human consideration is this degree of failure. Now, sometimes you can automate that by monitoring and understand the context of the scope of failure. That helps you with this. But in the end, I could probably override it as well. So here you're seeing disruption of service across entire business units. Significant impacting, including VIPs. Note the VIP is higher than an individual who might be not a persona relative to mission, right? So even when I attach a person record to the ticket, if there's a role relative to that SLA that, again, an online trader, this person belongs to an online trading group, the moment I put this person attached to the ticket, it automates the escalation and notification to a higher level. So when you've got this basic model in place and you've pre-populated your tool and automated some of this, what you can then get to is something like this, right? So now I have this combination of impact on the left, urgency on the top, and I know that if it's a mission critical, direct to mission service, and it's across the board, well then I might definitely have a critical incident, which might then require me to call into play my major incident process, which is separate and distinct from my normal process. And that's a question. If it's high, this might be the indicator, at least to when you begin to automate the triggering of that process. Notably, if we've got low or high, we've got different classifications. Again, note that I've tried to keep it here in a simple model. This is actually just a 3x3 matrix, because after you get beyond 4, which is my recommended max, it becomes something that's unwieldy. But again, the last thing you want to do is just to leave this to individual interpretation, because I guarantee you what happens from that context is that you begin to get simply the squeaky wheel syndrome. So now let's argue that we've got a shared classification structure that's been used consistently, right? I've got a shared priority model across multiple processes. Now what I can do is to automate escalations, alerting, and notification. But that's dependent on the first two things being true. So this is an example from an incident or service restoration perspective. And so what I've got going on here is priority 1 through 4 on the left-hand side. Priority 1, let's call this, mission critical disaster across the majority of the organization, so it's pretty nasty. I want to make sure I get that restored pretty quick. Versus 4, probably something that's going to be more individualistic. So I'm going to have a number of things begin, right? So you see the menu at the bottom. I'm notifying the assignment groups, maybe verbally. I'm alerting senior business stakeholders because it's a P1 issue. I'm not going to alert business stakeholders unless I'm telling my own internal IT senior management team, right? In fact, I might escalate it immediately to a team lead or a higher level person because it's that big, right? So I have either things firing automatically or I'm triggering manual activities. At 50%, let's say my P1 was restore a P1 incident within 4 hours, 80% of the time, right? So that's my target, being 4 hours, 80% of the time being my tolerance. For you, it might be 2 hours, but it doesn't matter. At the 50%, it's short in respect to time frame. I better be triggering some more action because for me to, at 50%, still meet my now 2 hours from now goal, I'm going to have to make sure people are paying attention. At 75%, anxiety is growing, so I'm going to be triggering things, before I get to 100%, which is now 4 hour mark. And at 4 hour, I have to let people know that now we have just reached SLA. Now I might do this over again. If I hit 8 hours, I might do a separate set of activities. But what you're seeing here is that I've predefined a set of either automated and or manual alerts and notifications to go out in respect to how big is big and how small is small. Now, you can't do this or even automate this until you have the other things in place because no one takes them seriously. Everything's a P1 and basically you end up shutting off all your automation because no one agrees that the world should get paged and senior management should be escalated to every 30 minutes. So these tools are designed to do this, but they are not going to work unless you gain organizational agreement around the definition around these models. And what I find, unfortunately, over and over again, is that people buy these 500,000 plus tools that do all of this wonderfully, but it's completely turned off because of the lack of design and consideration and organizational change management required to gain agreement and consensus around these as policies, as models. So one last example here, I'll be turning it over to Vincent. You might say, well, how do I use this in a context of multiple dimensions? Okay, so fair question. So here's an example, again, another customer example from an organization in the oil industry. And what they did is they already had predefined scales, as you can see, revenue generating, business continuity planning, classification from their BIA analysis. They had security classification in respect to the confidentiality and classification of data, brand exposure, safety exposure, SOX related. And what we ended up doing was aligning the various models and coming up with a point system. So walking through each of these, understanding, is it a 1, 2, 3, or 5 revenue generating, and 5 being, direct to revenue, the 5 being high in this case. Each time we would classify each line, we would have a certain point system. We could even weight those points based on how mission critical each of the classification models were. The weighting would then give me my total weighted points, as you can see, and then the cumulative points from all of the above allowed me to understand the implications of now multiple scales. So in this example, I have a 15.75 total cumulative score, which, as you can see below, is greater than 10, automatically putting me into the high, and this is an urgency model, by the way. So that allows me to understand at least one dimension from multiple perspectives. If you're interested, I have a blog post on my blog, Troy Dumoulin blog. You can just search that. It's called The Practicality of Prioritization, and you can download this as an example. So last thing I'm going to say is let me walk you through now kind of how this all works out using an actual case scenario from my past. It goes back a couple of years, but it's still very useful as a case scenario. So here's the situation. A company I was working with at one point, they were having ongoing and significant issues around their email system. I told you I'd come back. It didn't even occur to them that it was ongoing, and probably until it got into 2 or 3 months later, but this was organizational wide. So it just seemed to be around the end of every month, the email system would completely fail, and the end result was that they had to shut down the servers involved and basically reboot the system, and up she would come. So eventually, after this had happened 4 or 5 times, right, and the world had melted, the question was asked, what's going on and why is it happening, and how do we stop it from happening? By the way, every time this happened, we'd have all these incidents flood in. We would have a crisis team be called, and then major incident process ensue. So that was a lot of human capital just in the service restoration, let alone the business impact of the failure. But eventually somebody said, let's stop the insanity, let's get off the hamster wheel here and figure out what's going on. So they began to do what we'll call problem management, as you can see bottom left corner. And their initial perspective was that the email service was failing and it had something to do with software and or data. So they tried different things. They tried to stabilize the environment. They even added more memory, thinking it was a memory leak issue at one point. But a couple of experiments produced finally the root cause. And what was happening was when the system came under heavy load at the end of month end, this was a financial industry company, what was happening was the servers would overheat within the specific rack. And so when they took this thing down and they had shut down machines and they opened the door and basically rebooted it, it recovered because of the overheating, of course, diminished. Now what you don't know is that this door situation was relatively recent. 3 to 4 months earlier, at the beginning of this process, a security review had been done at the data center, and it was realized that all the racks had their doors taken off when they were installed. And of course, this was a policy that couldn't be tolerated, so security demanded that all the doors be reinstalled. What they didn't take into account was the load in the heating scenario when they reinstalled the doors and locked the cabinets. So they realized that they had produced this solution inadvertently with this rack configuration. Now they had to come up with a solution, and they had a couple of different options. One, take the doors off. Low tech, low cost. Another, replace the rack and its individual cooling system. Another, change all the environmentals in the data center. Obviously, you probably can imagine which they decided to do. Despite the chagrin of the security department, they went back to they take the door off the rack, at least that specific rack that was involved. And so a change, was put forward, and that issue is removed. Now, I wouldn't even known that this was a pattern of relationship unless I had this data correlation going on, and the prioritization allowed me to understand this was major. Because this wasn't effective, people weren't asking the questions, haven't we seen this before? Or this is a real nasty thing we all agree is big and disastrous, we should probably do something about it, open a problem record. When this is working, we have a virtuous cycle going on. When this is broken, we're all just shooting from the hip. And that's the problem that we're all in, often because of this. The tools aren't able to tell us what we don't and haven't automated. So, interesting story is a cautionary tale. Vincent, over to you, sir.
Well, thank you, Troy. So I am going to share my screen. Just going to check with Jesse. Can you see my screen? Yes, good. Okay. So thank you again, Troy, for sharing with us some of the best practices here when it comes to classification, categorization, and the prioritization of incidents, and which goal is to make IT organization more efficient. So what I want to talk about now is how much impact a given incident has on the business customer. And to illustrate my point, what I'll do is I will share with you some of the findings that of a recent survey that we conducted with Everbridge on the state of incident management. And I'm going to start with going back to the last example that Troy talked about, which was, if you remember, an email outage. Now, what I'd like to do is take that same example, but now from a business customer point of view. So please meet Cindy here. She works in a legal department. She's remote, and as you can tell, she is going through some difficulties here. Indeed, she's trying to send an important contract to one of her company's biggest customers. But it's 5 p.m., and just like in Troy's example, email is down. And this can be, as you know, can have a huge impact on the business, as we all know, right? Especially if today is the last fiscal day of the year for Cindy. And this is just an example. An email outage is only one of the many reasons why companies can experience major incidents. So what we did with our survey, we asked that question to 152 IT professionals and asked them to tell us about the top causes for major incidents at their organizations last year, so in the past 12 months. And here's what we found out. We found out that, as you can see here, network and IT component failures came first, 61 and 58%. Then comes the business applications failures, and we could consider here the Outlook issue, the email issue that Cindy is facing to be a business application failure. So that would fall under the third bucket here. And some of the other top causes were unplanned maintenance, release deployment issues, data center outages, and we were surprised by the last item here on the list, cyber attack and DDoS attack, only making it to 14% of the top causes of major incidents. Now, the second thing that we wanted to know was about the impact on the business. We always talk about the impact on the business, but what is it really, right? There's very little information about the real cost of unplanned IT downtime. There's a good report that you can read, published by the Poneman Institute, that can give you some indication. So same thing we did here is we had that question. So can you estimate the cost of unplanned downtime on your organization? And here's the finding. The respondents to this survey collectively answered, and we were able to come up with an average cost of unplanned downtime to be around $8,662 per minute. So if you do the math, you'll see that this is more than $500,000 per hour. So given this result here, and as we can see, this can get very expensive very quickly, right? So what we wanted to understand is where and how CIOs and IT organizations were indeed trying to reduce this cost. So what we did next is we looked into the very process of resolving major incidents. And to make it easy and industry agnostic, I like to break this process into five phases. The first phase is if we are experiencing an incident, first IT needs to be made aware of this incident. And Troy explained very well, how we can apply best practices to find out how big is big, how bad is bad, and come up with the detection in the identification, classification, categorization, and ultimately to the prioritization of the incident. So let's say we have a major incident. Now comes phase 2. We need to identify what team or who's going to be responding to this particular incident. So who are going to be these IT staff, those experts that can start investigating the issue. Once they do identify or isolate the root cause, then they're going to put together a remediation plan. They will get it approved by the CAB, the Change Advisory Board, or the Emergency CAB. Then they'll be allowed to execute the remediation plan. And last but not least, we'll make sure that after the change that we've made, the service has been restored, right? So this is pretty much the process of resolving a major incident. And we usually look at this process in terms of efficiency by looking at the mean time to restore. So I've put the MTTR here as an indication. So now what I'm going to do is look at this phase 2 here, response team assembled. And in the survey that we conducted, we asked those IT professionals how and what solution or how were they able to identify who to contact in case of major incidents. And this is the answer. So as we can see, only 11% of the respondents said that they used a centralized on-call schedule management solution. Therefore, they were able to identify pretty quickly who should be responsible or who should be responding to the different incidents based on the nature, based on the priority, and so on and so forth. But almost 30% of the respondents told us that they had no formal process in place to manage on-call personnel. And 24%, so a fourth of the people, said that they used spreadsheets and company phone books to identify who to call. And that's fine. And that's fine if it works, right? So we then asked them, we said, okay, whatever the solution you're using today or the techniques you're using today, once you've identified the people that you want to respond to the major incident, how do you technically reach out to them? And this is their answer. For 83% of the respondents, they use emails to communicate with their IT teams. And that was, to be honest, that was very surprising to us. Why? Because if I want to send you an email, let's say I need you to be on this restoration call. If I send you an email, I have no way to know if you've opened my email. I have no way to know if you've taken any action following this email that you've received from me. So, and that's for many, many reasons. One could be that you're away from your desk. You can be in a meeting. You can be on PTO. You can be on vacation. Or you may just be sleeping because we're not working on the same time zones, right? And as far as I know, emails don't wake up anybody at 2 o'clock in the morning. So this is why we were kind of surprised by this answer. And this was the segue to the next question for us, which is, okay, again, whatever solution you use to reach out to your response team. Now, what I'd like to know is how much time does it take your organizations between the moment where when you've declared a major incident and the time where all the required IT staff is actively collaborating on a conference call? And here's the answer. The answer is it takes an average of 27 minutes to assemble the response team. So again, for phase 2 here, it takes 27 minutes to get the right IT experts on board. Now, in the meantime, remember Cindy, she is still stuck at home waiting for someone to fix her email issue, right? Which is not only impacting her to do her job, but in this case, that's a company-wide outage. So what's interesting now that we have data, we can do the math. So let's do the math once again. So if we multiply the 27 minutes by the average cost that was given previously in the survey, you see that it's the cost of assembling the team comes up to more than $230,000 per major incident, which is a pretty significant number. So if we were to do the math again, and we would ask that those respondents multiply this number by the number of major incidents that they've experienced in the past 12 months to give them an idea of how much does it really cost to the business or to the organization for a full year. So given this information, this is an area where IT service alerting solutions and Everbridge can help organizations. And what we found out is a lot of IT organizations are too busy or don't even know that there are solutions available out there to help them with that. And that's pretty much what we do at Everbridge. We help IT organizations improve their incident communication, so reaching out to the IT staff, but also senior management, key stakeholders, and impacted customers, improve their incident response so they can consistently engage their IT response team in 5 minutes or less. How we do it? Based on the nature and the priority of the incident, the system will automatically locate the right on-call staff. It will then automatically reach out to the right people via different communication channels, can be SMS, can be voice, so on and so forth, and provide the very people with the collaboration tools so that they can start addressing IT issues as quickly as possible. And for today, if these are my takeaways for you, if there are 3 things that you can do today, here's what I would recommend. The first thing you want to do is assess what we could call here the average time to find someone. Therefore, how much time does it take your organization, your team, from the moment where a major incident has been declared to the moment where your IT experts are actively collaborating on the resolution of the incident? If you find out that this mean time is better than 5 minutes, then great, you're doing a great job, and you have good processes in place and good solutions in place. Now, if it's higher than 5 minutes, then the good news is there may be room for improvement. So the suggestion I would make here would be to review your on-call schedule management solution. So basically, how do you know who to contact in case of a major incident? And escalation process, if those people, those primary IT staff are not available, who's next? Who's available? Who's next in line? And how do I automatically escalate to those people? And finally, I would review your notification and communication system to see if, like we saw in the survey, you heavily rely on email, or if you have a multimodal communication approach to notification. And with that, I think we have a few minutes for questions. So over back to you, Jesse.
Great, thank you so much, Troy. Thank you so much, Vincent. So now, as Vincent just said, we are going to go into a Q&A session, so you can enter your questions in the Q&A panel in GoToWebinar. So we have a few of them coming in asking about the slides and the recording. Yes, we will be sending those out later this week. And the other one that comes in, I think is pointed to Troy. Troy, what are the implications of not using shared model across an ITSM processes?
Yeah, so I'll go back to my statement earlier. The reality is that for you to actually collectively get the power of the integrated nature of the ITSM process model, you have to be designing your classification structures with that in mind. And it's challenging, as I mentioned, because a lot of times we do divide and conquer, and each group just takes another, process and goes off and does their own thing. But think about that metaphor I use with classification structure, the shared priority model. It automates so many things for the workflow processes to work together and work together effectively. For you not to do this up front, first of all, you probably can't use the automation you bought the tool for, right? It gets turned off because it's not effective. But in essence, the metaphor is if it's a vertebrae that connects all these processes, I want you to imagine that vertebrae is fused and crippled. And that is an exactly accurate metaphor for the effectiveness of your processes. And everyone will blame, by the way, the tool, but it's not the tool's fault, not at all.
Great. Another question coming in, I believe also probably for you, Troy. Do you have any tips to get organizational agreement around prioritization and other process models?
Mm-hmm. So the reality is, if we can do less unplanned work, and that's what we've been talking mostly about, then we have more capacity, more availability of our time to do more intentional planned actions. When I'm looking at organizations who haven't done this well, we can look at some very high numbers of unplanned work. When I typically have the conversation, when they assess their percentage of unplanned work in a week, and I go through a couple of thinking models with them, and then I add their meeting time, which is also non-value added work in the context of a lean premise of getting work done that means something, then they can be upwards of 80% of their total capacity in unplanned and meeting time. Puppet Labs just released their recent notification, or their recent survey as well, and they talked about a non-optimized team being in the 49% range of unplanned work. So you don't even know what percentage or what your unplanned work looks like until you know, and you can't get a good sense of that until you get some accurate data coming out of your tools around where are the issues that you're facing, how many are you getting, who kind of them are you getting, and how do I then start to feed those back into problem management to remove the repeat nature of these things, to claw my way back out of this deep hole that we've gotten ourselves into, an unplanned work, which, by the way, Lean would call waste. Right? It's not adding value to the organization. So back to the question, how do I build consensus? And you got to basically attack it this way. How much time do you guys want to spend of your available capacity doing the same things over and over again without asking the question why? So last time I checked, Vincent and Jesse, that was the definition of insanity.
Exactly. I agree with that.
Great. Well, thank you, Troy, and I'm very sorry to announce that we have just about run out of time. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Like I said, the slides and the recording will be sent out later this week. You can also download the slides right now from the handouts section of GoToWebinar. To learn more about Everbridge IT Learning, how we can help automate the notification or alerting side of it, visit itlearning.com. And if you have any questions from the speakers, I'll leave up their contact information slides so you can reach out to them. And once again, thank you for joining us, everyone. Thanks, Troy. Thanks, Vincent.
Thank you.
Thank you.